You're listening to Table Talks for Life, a Y4Life podcast that prepares youth to be gospel-motivated voices for life. Be sure to stick around after today's live recording to find out how you can be engaged in upholding life too. Welcome to our podcast, our Table Talks for Life. This session, we're going to be talking about the topic of sex and gender. Is it all just a construct? This is Michelle Bauman speaking. I'm the director of Y4Life, and I have with me today 3 guests. I will let them introduce themselves. Ready, set, go.
Pastor Michael Salemink. I serve as executive director at Lutherans for Life.
I'm Bonnie Poole. I'm the media resource assistant for Y4Life.
And I'm Pastor Brian Barlow, and I'm a pastor here in Southern California at a small church in the North LA County.
Thank you so much for joining us, for joining the conversation today. I've been looking forward to this one since the beginning. I don't know about Bonnie, but when we were, I think so, yeah. When we were looking over all the different topics, this was one that we both were excited about, and I know the rest of the team is too. So let's start off with definitions. That will guide our discussion. And there's 3 words I think that we'll want to define. The first would be sex, the second gender, and the third gender brokenness. So definition for sex, I'll go ahead and take that one. I think today we'll be defining sex, and not just today, but in general, we would say that sex is the biological makeup. So whether we are a boy or a girl, based on our genetics. And so, and biologically that cannot and does not change. But what about gender?
Gender is, generally speaking, how we embody and live out that sexuality in the relationships with people around us. Whereas the adjectives that we use to describe sex are male and female, like Michelle said, according to X and or Y chromosomes. The adjectives that we use for gender are masculine and or feminine, as those correspond to one's anatomy and physiology. Okay,
thank you. And how about gender brokenness?
I would consider gender brokenness to be anything that steps out of that norm, that is disconnected from our identity. And for the Christian, our identity is found in who God says we are and created in his image. And so he gives us form, and then he gives us function. And if we then reverse that and decide that we're going to reconstruct who we are by maybe our feelings and our experience, then that would distort gender in those roles and intent.
Excellent. I think just in your description of form and function, Pastor Barlow, I think you might actually have already answered the next question that I have prepared for us, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I think we can maybe expand on that a little bit more. So what do you think? We're going to answer the question right away. Are sex and gender constructs? Are they constructs in and of themselves? What do you think?
Well, constructs in the sense that we create what it is. I think gender, the unique expression of masculine and feminine, has been ordered and given us, through who God says that we are. When he created us in his image, he created us male and female. And in that, he gave us both the form of that in our biology, but he also gave us the function and how we were to relate to God and to one another, being fruitful and multiplying, increasing in number, ruling and subdue. Those are all functions. And I think that construction of that form has all kinds of really beautiful, integrated, whole enough relational aspects to it, that when we do that well, we have a life that has purpose and intent and balance. When we don't do that well, when we cut ourselves off from some of those original intentions, then we see all kinds of pathologies. The gender confusion and brokenness is one of those pathologies. but there's roots to that, that fragmentation, and we know that as original sin that distorts and disfigures that image. And I guess in that regard, I would say that as a result of that event, we struggle to understand who we are and in relationship to how we are to be as humans apart from knowing Christ.
Yeah, I think you're right, that brokenness, that because of sin, we do struggle. And then we do see that manifest in this recreation of who we are, right? You see this in individuals and this tendency toward believing maybe that sex and gender are just constructs. Is there anyone else who wants to jump in on this one?
So remember that by the word construct, we're talking about a category or a perception that is established by consensus of a society. So construct sometimes carries the connotation of arbitrary or not necessarily grounded in objective reality. By that definition, sex absolutely is not a construct, right? Because sex is entirely, except for some rare disorders that we're going to cover in a little bit, sex is entirely determined by one's X or Y chromosomes, and that is a binary, right? It's a yes or no thing. So there is confusion in the way that our culture discusses sex and gender today. One cannot change one's sex. It is simply impossible because that sex is coded and hardwired into the DNA that makes up every cell of your body and the way that your body systems are configured. When it comes to gender, there are many things about gender that, because it corresponds to sexuality, those things also have a grounding in objective reality. So when we talk about the givenness, how God gives us the gifts of our bodies, and those bodies are male and female, and they're male and female for the purpose of receiving his gifts and relating to one another. There are certain privileges, responsibilities, blessings, expectations that God builds into or designs into male and female in the way that they live out with each other. So, for example, men simply cannot be fathers or mothers. I'm sorry. Men cannot be mothers. Right. Women cannot be fathers, right? Men biologically cannot give birth. Whether our culture wants to converse or debate about whether a masculine individual can give birth, that's a different story. But males, physically, scientifically, males are incapable of that. So there are certain roles that the male anatomy and physiology is simply better suited to. There are certain roles that female anatomy and physiology is certainly better suited to. Now, there is a sense in which some cultural expectations, and especially caricatures and stereotypes about gender, are somewhat mediated by cultural trends. So take, for example, the garment that we typically call a skirt. Is that male or female? Well, that's going to depend on your cultural context, right? For example, in Elizabethan England, that garment is very feminine. But in Scotland, a kilt, which is kind of the same kind of garment as a skirt, is very masculine. Or other areas of the world where the typical clothing is not pants for males, where they wear body length garments. Those sorts of things can have some cultural dimension to them. But those don't have as much to do with how we live out our relationship in service to one another. So while there may be some dimensions about certain gender caricatures or stereotypes or expectations that may be polyvalent, right? And that word simply means could mean different things. In general, there are categories of masculine and feminine that, because they are tied to our biology, are not negotiable.
Okay. All right. So, well, Bonnie, I don't want to cut you off. Do you want to jump in on this one?
No, actually, I had one thing written out, but it was pretty much exactly what Pastor Salemink just said, just that some things might be, like, I think it's fair to say that some things that we kind of prescribe as feminine or girly or boyish, it might be a construct. I think they flow from the natural gifts and strengths and roles that God has given to the sexes. So they do hold some truth, but they aren't the definition of the two sexes. So liking to roughhouse was the example I thought of. Like, doesn't make you a boy, but because men are generally stronger and are meant to protect their families, it makes sense that physical activity and healthy competition draws them. And so just because a girl likes roughhouse doesn't mean that she's a boy, but it does tend to be a more masculine thing.
Okay, so we have some things that we can say, our tendencies. We can, and again, those tendencies bear out because of the numbers, right? We see these things so often in male or female that we would say, typically those are tendencies for that sex, and then therefore have some connection to gender. So how are, and everyone has mentioned this so far, that sex and gender are meant for service to others, right? That this is they're not just gifts to us, but also gifts to those around us. So how are then sex and gender gifts? How are both sexes, how are they necessary, and how are they gifts to others?
Well, we have the privilege of recalling that sexuality and gender, as envisioned by God's word, God's will, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Christian faith, are actually richer and broader than the way that our culture perceives them. Sexuality and gender right now, in this cultural moment where we live, seem to be bound up primarily with self-expression or gratification. Very inwardly directed sort of dynamics of those, perhaps because we live in a world that is so broken. Individuals are hurting, people are afraid, and so they become defensive and feel the need to protect themselves, right? And so we collapse inward on ourselves. From a Christian perspective, though, sexuality and gender are gifts first, means by which God has created us to receive his blessings, right? So God has not created human beings to be his slaves, or so that he can torture them for his own enjoyment. But God has created us to share in all of the good things that he has and that he wants to give. And sexuality and gender are primary means by which individuals are able to receive those blessings. But then also sexuality and gender, even at the most basic level, show that human beings are oriented towards relationship, right? Not just relationship with God, but relationship with one another, to receive one another as gifts and privileges, and to offer ourselves as means by which we can share life and make other people's lives better. That's kind of one of the basic principles of the Christian faith, is that other people are good things, right? Human beings are gifts and privileges, and relationships are good things. And so sexuality and gender as means by which we engage in those kind of relationships with the people around us are gifts in both of those dimensions.
Other thoughts? I love the reality that you show, or that you spoke of, right? That sexuality is a gift to us, and the phrasing that God wants us to share in the good things, or that it works as a means by which we receive his blessings. And I think, again, if we look at sexuality and gender in that light, we recognize not only the gift that's been given to us, but the gift we get to give to others, right? Through our sexuality, through our gender, through the ways in which we use it to serve others. So, Pastor Barlow, I may have cut you off. I'm so sorry.
No, not at all. I like what Michael had said about the givenness that is part of our gender identity. I think it's just maybe worth mentioning that, there's a real confusion in, I think, our culture today about what is true masculinity and what is true femininity. What does that look like? And I think when we look at just the fall and what got disfigured and disoriented in that whole thing, it's not always just how we give ourselves to the other, how we see the other person, but how we see ourselves. And I think for many that deal with gender confusion or dysphoria, they cut off what the good of who they are in their gender, if you will, like masculinity. Growing up feeling like I'm not a boy, or somehow I don't fit in, or I haven't really been affirmed because of some of those clear roles around a person, can be really confusing, or it can even be disabling if the models that you have for masculinity, if you're a boy, for say, having an absent father, not even a father around, or abusive father, can be, I don't want to be that, and so before they even get to the point of giving themselves and being, one in right relationship with another, they have to, be in right relationship with understanding who they are. And, it's interesting. There, a term that I've pondered over the last few years is sexual suicide, where a person literally makes a decision that who they are needs to be cut off. And I think that's both by sex and by gender. They can, deconstruct who they are, male or female, or masculine or feminine. But I like the focus on giveness, because when we are brought more into a whole enough relationship in an engendered self, we start to see just how we fit to bless another person's life, and that people, in particular in the opposite gender, aren't necessarily my problem; they're my gift, right? And vice versa. So,
I like that that perspective as well. The opportunity to see others as a gift, which really does kind of hit on that second part of the question too. Why are they necessary? Obviously they are necessary because God has deemed them so, right? That he provides good gifts through males and good gifts through females, gifts that he desires to give, but also without one, life doesn't happen, right? We see just very basically, biologically, life doesn't come to be without the gift of the opposite sex. And then the gender roles that are tied to that sex are necessary too for affirming the life of a child, for affirming the family, for affirming the spouse. I don't know, Bonnie, if you want to jump on this as a new mom and wife, and go ahead.
Yeah, well, just what you just said about, they are necessary because it's how God designed it to work, right? So you don't get family children without the two. And I think that's in some ways one of the best kind of evidences for the binary, is just, for all that we've been able to do with technology and scientific advancement in, creating life outside of the womb, introducing it. So surrogacy or embryo implantation, so that same-sex couples or whatever sort of non-heterosexual relationship people might be in, where they're trying to have kids. At the end of the day, what they do is bring a sperm and an egg together, and that's from a male and a female. And so, yeah, it's very clear cut. I think that's a really strong evidence for the fact that sex is binary. And yeah, that is how God designed it to work, and all of that within the confines of marriage. And so that's one thing, just to go back to the gift, just that God has given us these gifts in marriage, and from that comes family, and then all of the joys that come along with that, and also being the joy of being in a committed lifelong relationship with someone, and someone who is not like you. And of course, women are different from one another and men are different from one another, but there's something very different about men and women. And so having different roles and different strengths and completing each other in that way is a gift.
Yeah. And, not just for the couple, but for the family, right? There's so much good research out there that shows the benefits of both mother and father in a child's life, and the necessity of both in a child's life for formation, intellectually, emotionally, understanding their role in the future, those sorts of things. Not to say that families, that others can't fill in various ways when a family is missing a mother or a father, and yet research does show that there is suffering that happens when that is the case, right? And that there is loss, and so it's not just necessary to the couple, it's not just necessary to life, but also to the children, who have been beget and need the love of both a mother and a father. Anyone else want to jump in on this one before we move on? So the next question I have then is, again, we're talking about how both are necessary, and yet our culture encourages us to believe that males and females are interchangeable. And so I guess I'd love to hear your views on that. Is it true? Can it work? We know biologically it can't work, but what about in family structures where there are two moms or two dads? Does that work? What are your thoughts? Or if you don't want to go that way, can a person change his or her gender?
The answer is yes and no, right? It depends on the context. Are male and female interchangeable? Well, masculinity and femininity are not interchangeable. Sperm and egg are not interchangeable. Father and mother are not interchangeable. On the other hand, there are certain tasks, roles, contexts in which a male can do that and a female can do that. Now, a male is always going to perform that task or function as a male, and each individual male is going to perform that task or function as an individual male, and the same goes for individual females. So there will always be two different dimensions in which each individual performs that particular task. The dimension of their own personality and the dimension of their sex and their gender. And so, who can play basketball, right? Who can play sports, males or females? Well, the answer I think is pretty clear, that in that sense, there's an interchangeableness, right? But when we are talking about, could we, for example, flourish as a society made up of all males or all females or all androgynous persons who attempt to have no masculinity or femininity? I would suggest that we would be very impoverished as a society, to the point of dysfunction and destruction, being without those dimensions that God has constructed bodies to bring. Certainly in the context of procreation and marriage and family. Michelle, you already mentioned the research, the science on those sorts of things is very clear. At the end of the day, like Bonnie said, it's as close as your belly button that every human being comes from somebody else's body, and not just from one somebody else's body, but from two somebody else's bodies. And those two bodies are different as the male and female sex. That's part of what's wonderful about sexuality and gender, is the complementarity. It forces us to need somebody else. So every individual human body has a variety of complete physiological systems, skeletal systems, nervous systems, circulatory systems, endocrine systems, except for your reproductive system. That you only have half of, right? And it does not perform its function without the corresponding half that belongs to one's spouse, and particularly one's spouse of the corresponding sex. And so that complementarity is as basic as our origin, right? That origin that defines who we are. At the same time, that is wonderful. It reminds us that we have something to give and we have something to receive from not just a spouse, but the gendered others around us, the male neighbors and the female neighbors. So one of the difficulties of living in a time that we live right now, where sexuality and gender have become blurred or muddied or debated, is the loss of a genuine place for same-sex friendships, right? With the widespread acceptance of same-sex marriage. The assumption is kind of made that relationships operate like a pyramid, and the pinnacle of that pyramid is the sexual relationship of spouses, right? And all other relationships are ordered towards that. But of course, that forgets the fact that there are some relationships that are non-sexual, not just because they haven't reached sexuality yet, or because they're not intense enough, but because they're not designed to be that way. You think of the relationship between a parent and a child, or brothers and sisters, or same-sex friends, platonic relationships. Every human being is designed to need not just the love and affirmation of a mother and a father, but also love and affirmation from same-sex peers and corresponding or opposite sex peers. That's why sexuality and gender as a complementarity matters so much, and why they can't be, one cannot stand in for the other. Each sex, each gender has unique contributions to make, and we do a disservice to all of humankind when we try to reduce those to kind of a base level.
Thank you for that. And go ahead, Bonnie.
I was just going to add that I appreciate you bringing up the friendship thing, Pastor Salemink, because I think that's so true. I think female friends are still kind of okay, right? Like, I don't think, but definitely male friendships have suffered so much because of just the uptick in celebration and acceptance and celebration of homosexuality, and men or young boys, young men don't know. They're afraid of, that sort of label, although even that is kind of going by the wayside, but they don't know how to relate to one another because they might be accused of something like that, or but it's so needed. Boys need their peers to, just like women do, their friends, and that's I think a huge toll, or a huge part of the toll in all of this sort of craziness with gender that's going on. I think friendships are really suffering, and that's very unfortunate.
Yep. And the idea that sexual relationships are the top of the pyramid, right? The thing that you should reach for. And so, yeah, that does make, friendships almost impossible unless you're going to be experimental with your sexuality, right? Which kind of leads us into the next question. And the idea of experimenting is very, I guess, common in your high school, college years, not necessarily experimenting sexually, but discovering who you are, right? In your high school and college years, trying out band and choir, as well as basketball and soccer, figuring out what your skills are and what your abilities are, what you like. It's a time in your life when you're growing and things are awkward, and you're rediscovering who you will become, how your body has changed from day to day. And so, one of the things that as a teacher, I ran into quite a bit was just this questioning of self, this questioning of identity, and sometimes wrapped up in that identity then was this questioning of sexuality, or, is it because I feel such a close relationship with my friend, like Bonnie said, does that mean I'm, homosexual or lesbian or those sorts of things, and trying to come to terms with the world's definitions for what we're feeling. And so I guess the question I have for you is, or this next one, is it normal to question one's sexuality, or to question where one fits sexually, or is that something that youth should be concerned about?
I can start here if that's okay. I do think it's normal to explore, like you were saying, as you're growing up, what it means to be male or female, and like what we're doing right now, even, or what you and I, Michelle, have been doing, and kind of developing these resources, like really trying to sit down and think, like, what does it mean to be male and to be female, or to be masculine and feminine?
Right.
But so for youth, like puberty is a time where that happens naturally. Like you were saying, you're learning more about what it means to be the sex that you were given, that you have, that you've had since birth, when you're actually developing these secondary sex characteristics that you didn't yet have. And so kind of learning what that all means. And I do think it's somewhat a product of living in such a wealthy, stable, peaceful, privileged society, right? That we have the luxury to kind of sit there and navel gaze and kind of wonder, like, what is this body that I'm living in every moment? Does it really reflect who I am? So a little bit, it's kind of a product of our time. Like I recently watched the Matt Walsh, What is a Woman? And he went to,
right.
I can't remember where, somewhere in Africa, and they were all just, some tribe, very astounded that this was even a concept, because they are, living off the land. They don't have time, resources to just sit there and kind of think about themselves so very much. But
right.
Anyway, I do think it's still somewhat normal to just consider yourself. But what is not normal is what's going on right now, which is this encouragement, celebration, and then even like urging young people, very young people, kids, elementary age and younger, to question their gender and their sex, and to like be searching out whether their feelings really match their biological sex. Especially when they haven't gone through puberty, they don't have like sexual feelings that they can even study or reflect on. And so I think that just inevitably confuses kids and is a huge contributing factor to why we are seeing the dramatic increase that we are in transgenderism and just identifying as something other than male and female in general.
Right. That desire for belonging has become so overpowering, right? And so if we're going to explore, and we have people encouraging us to explore in that area, well, then maybe that is, we convince ourselves that maybe that's the case, and you're right. It isn't normal to have someone tell you these feelings might mean you're homosexual. These feelings might mean you're not really a girl, that you're really a boy, but you just happen to be born in the wrong body. That's not normal. Good. What other thoughts do we have?
I think what's interesting is that it's just the term explore, or question, this kind of thing. How we define those terms are so important, in the context of a disintegrated family where there's not clear roles or examples, for an integrated whole enough person, like a father or mother, for a child to be in that context, there might be a lot more questions, about what am I to be, or what's good and what fits and what's normal, but for those that have the blessing to grow up with a mom and a dad that stay together and integrate well enough together, the need for exploration, those kinds of things aren't as severe. And many of the folks that I've worked with over years in ministry that deal specifically with gender confusion and dysphoria can attest to those who have had these natural questions about, well, who am I in relationship to others and myself and my body and all those kinds of things. If there was confusion expressed early on because of the clarity in their own home and community, they came out of it, pretty much on track without major, professional intervention that we might consider in our world today, which is anything including psychotherapy and doctors and all the different kinds of stuff that can kind of go into the context of intervention if someone shows signs of confusion today. For those that don't have those kind of safe places in place, those pillars, then what we see that's really disturbing today is that the influences and the attention that is legalized in our institutions and the schools and in California, even in the government, taking away parental influence and rights, to do that. And those lay vulnerable to all kinds of agendas that normally wouldn't even be a question. I remember our oldest, he was probably 3 or 4, and we had attended to some friends of ours out in a community that was highly volatile in terms of gender confusion and stuff in Southern California. And we went to the stroke recovery center there in that community because one of our friends had a stroke, an elderly couple. While we were there, because of the conditioning of this community, there was a transgender male that was dressed all like a woman and tried to be as much of a woman as he could be. And when we walked around the corner touring this facility, this person goes up to our son and puts his hands on his knees and he goes, "Oh, aren't you just sweet?" And our 4-year-old just responded without any kind of prompting or any disdain, just said, "Why are you a woman? You can't be a mother. You're not a mom. Mom, why is he a mom? He's not a mom." And it was just like there's this, out of the mouth of babes, this very clear guide in his heart of what it meant to be a boy and what a girl was supposed to be, and a mom and a dad in their vocation. It was just really, it was beautiful to see, and settling for our son's parents, myself, because it wasn't like we were sitting down with a curriculum saying, this is how you have to be. This is what God intends. We were living life in an integrated, whole enough and Christian manner where we have a biblical anthropology of our bodies. And so it's fascinating today to see how much is propagated with our children that really results in this disoriented, disfigured, reality. And there is just an onslaught of insecurity and questions that I don't know that part of it is normal. I would probably put that in more of a pathology or abnormal. But I think in general, questioning one's gender and stuff like that can be somewhat expected. If there's not some kind of interruption or maybe some trauma or abuse that has disoriented them out of the norm.
Yeah, I think everything you said right there just really affirms the need for Christian parents, Christian families, Christian role models, teachers, to be very active in the lives of youth and to be affirming their identity, right? Who God made them to be, whether it is through very purposeful spoken words, or as in the case of, your son, just again, living what it means to be male or female, right? The gift of male or female, the gift of family, and affirming that as good. It's so important because, of course, society is not affirming that, right? Is
right.
aiding to the confusion. So then I guess, we alluded to it earlier that there may be some conditions where that questioning would be enhanced, or where this confusion would be more pronounced. Does anyone want to explain what? Go ahead, Pastor Salemink. I can see you're ready.
Well, from the from the medical perspective, from the biological perspective, there's a certain category of disorders of sexual development. Sometimes these are called intersex conditions. They're not, it doesn't always amount to an intersex condition, but some individuals are born with or conceived with the typical genotype for female is 2 X chromosomes. Typical for male is 1 X and 1 Y. There are individuals who are born with more than 2 X chromosomes, more than 1 Y chromosome. Some individuals are conceived with X and a half chromosomes, and all of those have impacts on development of external genitalia, as well as some other sex-linked characteristics. It's very, very, very rare that we are unable to determine what went wrong. In other words, what is deviating from the way that it's supposed to be, right? And that supposed to be is what tells us a person's sex. But we do, I think, need to be sensitive to the fact that there are a very small minority of individuals who scientifically, biologically, it may be difficult to determine what sex they were designed to be. We need to be sensitive to them, and it certainly is not responsible or fair to use those individuals as an excuse for the sexual license and self-determination that is really the agenda of pushing the boundaries on sexuality and gender in the public today. But there are also, I think Pastor Barlow alluded to some contexts where there are psychological situations, emotional development situations that can, while a person's sex may be clear and the gender that's tied to that sex may be clear, there may be a great deal of emotional and psychological difficulties in taking ownership of that sexuality and that gender, feeling affirmed, accepted, valuable as that sex and that gender. And that requires a sensitivity that doesn't sarcastically make fun of or make light of those difficulties, the way that some theological and cultural conservatives like to do because they feel threatened or they feel angry, making fun of, they call it the LGBT alphabet soup or whatever. Those sorts of remarks and attitudes I don't think are helpful to individuals who genuinely struggle, and even individuals who don't themselves genuinely struggle with psychological difficulties, emotional and relational difficulties, or biological difficulties. They may have loved ones who do, and it is only right to feel compassionate towards them, sympathetic, and to want to defend their well-being. I mean, everybody can agree no one should be bullied for any reason, right? Just because Christians affirm a sex binary and a complementarity of gender does not mean that gives us the right to be jerks or obnoxious or treat other people as somehow less valuable because of who they are or who they think they are or what they believe. And so remembering that there are genuine things that make this complicated for a lot of people and folks who simply don't have all of the available information. They're misinformed. They've been deceived. So approaching with compassion and sensitivity and a good deal of humility, recognizing that it is not just people who experience same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria who are caught up in brokenness, right? All human beings are caught up in brokenness. And even those of us who have been sexually chaste until marriage and sexually chaste inside of marriage and are married to a spouse of the corresponding sex, that doesn't mean that we don't experience sexual brokenness, right? There are all kinds of lusts and perversions that really ruin and threaten the gifts of sexuality and gender that God gives to us. And that affects all of us. And that's what we really need salvation from.
Yeah, I think your comments definitely, I hope to come back to them at the end too, when we talk about, how do we serve those who are struggling, right? How do we best serve and uphold their lives. But I want to jump off of one of the things that you mentioned, as far as maybe you spoke of those who have very real reasons for some confusion, whether they are genetic or whether they are situational, right? Some things that people can experience. What we've seen lately is an increase in the desire to transition, right? And what I'm wondering is, do you think that, why do you think that is? Do you think that's because there are more broken families and we're not seeing the role model? Do you think it is? I talked to someone, just earlier today, about the idea of social contagion. Do you think it is just misinformation and the work of the media? What are your thoughts on this? Because again, the idea of transitioning, it wasn't so popular 15 years ago or 20 years ago, but it's become much more acceptable or even practiced. Go ahead.
I'll comment.
Yeah,
I think the tendency is to especially with this being June and all the things that are being paraded across our screens, local television and news out here in California, is we can't even let our kids watch because it's an ad. And even in the off times, there's all kinds of ad and different things in their media world that send these imageries and stuff like that. It is easy to say that's the problem. And I think that I just want to say that if we focus so much on that, then we're provoked by everything. We're kind of caught up in this whole everything's bad and what are we going to do about it? The real starting point is we are sinful by nature. And this absence of a clear gospel in the church today, I think, has a bigger implication. Yes, there's a movement, there's an organized, intentional, agenda to come at the person in humanity and reconstruct them and remake them, recreate them in this world's image. Yet I really believe that so much of the disintegration in our own churches has lost the base by which we come to the cross and our need, that we are sinful in need of a great Savior, and there needs to be a recreation in our own person. And when the church starts to adapt to this dying and decaying world in message, which is what's going on in so many denominations, that have once been really clear about repent and believe, and that there is a way out of the dying, a way out of the grave into life that's whole enough, and eternal. That's, I think, the bigger concern I have with this. It's one thing to see the world present this is life. It's a whole nother thing to see the church, which once had a different message, now start to agree with those things, and propagate false gospels and disoriented things. That's more concerning to me. And personally, in my own life, that impacted me some 20 years ago when I thought a Christian counselor who was biblical and scriptural gave me some of the worst advice, and implied that maybe God created me less than male, that I should pursue a homosexual life, that might be how God created me. When the church starts to give those kinds of messages, this becomes that much more explosive, I think, in nature, in the family. And I don't know that that's, that it's just our media, and all that kind of, certainly that is just kind of, grown exponentially. But I'm more concerned about the messages they're getting from, pastors and lay leaders and those that identify with Christ.
Yeah, you're certainly right. There have been denominations that have embraced it, right? Embraced this false belief that gender doesn't matter, that sex doesn't matter, and that God's design isn't how he designed it in Genesis, right? That God's design has changed in some way. I think that's very insightful, perspective. Other comments?
For those who do attend, are in families who go to like churches where true repentance and forgiveness are taught, and sin is called sin. So, for example, like Lutheran Church, the LCMS, I should say, would be preaching that. I think people are still struggling with this at increased rates, even in church Christian families, and I think we should acknowledge that social media and sort of unfettered internet access that kids have through their phones and just other devices that parents don't always realize. And I think they are starting to realize that more and more, but people like to belong. I think we've kind of alluded to that already. And so for especially what's happening right now is an increase, especially in like preteen, teenage girls who struggle so much with sort of fitting in and just internal turmoil of not being enough, not being quite right. Just it's not a fun time. But just they are looking for a way to belong, and maybe they don't feel wanted by boys at the time or whatever. They can get access to sort of all of these really fringe, intense, sort of trans influencer type things, and kind of just be taught, be indoctrinated by them, unbeknownst to any of their pastors, parents, teachers, and it just sort of happens in the background, and parents are totally caught off guard. And that's something. So then they kind of get the idea like, oh, that would make me distinct. That would make me popular because it is popular. And so they suddenly find a place to belong and are sort of respected for taking on this new status, which is sold as something like, oh, it's kind of oppresses you. It's kind of like brings you down. And so that's why people praise you. When in reality, people praise you for it. So it is kind of a badge of honor. And so I think Pastor Barlow, you're absolutely right that Christian churches need to be teaching that sin is sin and that Jesus forgives and redeems. But also I would just say that social media and sort of all that's going on the internet is also extremely influential, even for people who do hear that message in church or at home.
So that social contagion component.
Right.
Yeah. And there is, you think of the other structures too that influence a child's life, the educational system, the medical fields. When we don't claim an absolute truth, when we don't believe that male and female are distinct and separate, we don't listen to the science, right? We deny the science even, then we have an issue even in the structures that have influences on our children's lives. Like I think 21 years of teaching, I was never asked my administration would never have asked me to refer to a child by an alternative gender, right? If male or female, whether that child wanted to be called, change his or her pronouns, that never would have been acceptable. And yet, my daughter-in-law, who is student teaching just this last semester, very much was encouraged to do that, right? To change pronouns according to the desire of the child and from day to day. And so again, I think, we have to look at the structures too that interact with our children outside of church, and what truths are being taught to them, right? When you can go to a counselor and say, I think I might be really a male instead of a female, and there's fear that's motivating that counselor to provide therapy or puberty blockers, I think, again, we have to look at our medical field, and is that too being influenced by a social contagion, or by a woke society. So perhaps there's a lot of things playing into that. What do you think as far as, would it be helpful just to share some of the long-term effects of gender transition? I mean, we know why isn't transitioning life affirming? What are your thoughts on that? What do we know?
Well, the gender transition, actually, genital mutilation surgery. So typically, the recommended course of therapy for an individual who is experiencing persistent gender dysphoria, if that individual is mid-pubescent or pre-pubescent, the first stage is usually what they call social transition. So begin presenting yourself as the other sex or a gender alternative that feels more authentic to you, and insist that the people around you affirm that. The second stage then is usually puberty blocking hormones. So artificial chemicals, pharmaceuticals that suppress the normal maturation process of the body. The third step then would be cross-sex hormones. So artificial chemicals that increase the amount of hormones that naturally occur in the body, but occur in greater proportions in the other sex. And then the final stage is that genital mutilation surgery, in which there's plastic reconstruction of the genitals to resemble the body of the other sex. All of those have emotional health risks. The last three have physical health risks that are very serious, including increased risk for cancers, infertilities, stroke, heart disease, and death. And those courses of action are relatively recent in world history, with the exception of transvestitism, which is presenting oneself as the other gender, really since the late 1970s. And it may be interesting to know that Dr. Paul McHugh, who is the pioneer of what we call gender transition surgery now at Johns Hopkins University, he actually discontinued performing those surgeries and left the clinic where he was at because the outcomes were so bad. We are now getting some of the first data that's available on the long-term effects of that. Most of those studies are showing that actually in addition to the medical after effects, the biological and physical side effects of hormonal therapies and genital mutilation surgeries, the suicide and depression rate actually goes up for people who medically transition. That's being entirely ignored or discounted by certain advocates. Folks should know that gender transition is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So there's lots of money to be made. There's prestige, there's reputation and social capital to be gained. So it's certainly not the case that all or even most of the people involved in it have altruistic motives. But the need to bear those things in mind and to get that information into the hands of people who need to know, because the narrative that is being told, especially to parents, is that depression and suicide rates for young people who experience same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria are very high. That is true. We need to acknowledge that. Whereas depression and suicide rates are already high amongst adolescents, they're even higher amongst what are called these sexual minority communities. But the data are inconclusive as to whether medically assisted transition actually provides any relief in the long term. While it may provide some immediate relief, we're talking 3 to 6 months. After that, the studies are showing that the outcomes are very grave. And so the question needs to be asked, is this the best approach that we have available, right? Is certainly we want to pay attention to the emotional needs of people who are suffering, but are there better approaches that are available to us? And why are we disadvantaging those approaches?
So how do we then, what, I guess, I'll throw this out to everyone, because you're right, the side effects are severe, right? There's bone loss, there's the idea or the reality that the frontal lobe may not be developed. I mean, there's some very serious physical side effects in addition to those emotional and mental. But so what should we do? How should we respond when someone has expressed a desire to transition or has already begun the process? What are your words of advice? And this is open to anybody.
I'll respond in part. It's not an easy, cookie cutter kind of thing. This is what you do. But one of the things I think that is so important, and we go back to just understanding what is masculinity, what is gender, what is God's intent relationally for that. When we're created in our sex as male and female, there are certain attributes that are just inborn and created with us, regardless of social, kind of conditioning or all those kinds of things. And I think when we are clear on that and have a clear biblical anthropology of that, we can then, even in a person who might be a little bit disordered or disfigured or influenced by some of the cultural kind of norms, we can call the truth out of them. And it's just a life-affirming thing. It's things that may not have words for it or language when a child is growing up. They may not even know how to tell you what's going on or what they're struggling with, but they know what they need in some regards. And I can just give you an example. I remember living in a disoriented way because of the poor counsel that I got at a very young age, and trying to be something that intrinsically I knew I wasn't. But everyone was saying, this is how you're going to have a whole enough life, and just, be happy and roll with it. And I remember I had a friend, and she and I hung out a lot of the times, and that's, we were both single, and we wanted to go out to dinner, to a movie. We called each other. There's no one significant in our lives. And I remember going out, and it wasn't just once or twice, but almost every time we went out, someone would see us enjoying ourselves in conversation or having a meal together and come up and say, you guys just are the greatest couple. It's so neat to see you guys together. You're just meant for each other. And there was something inside me that just swelled. Like I felt like a man, or I felt like I was whole enough in my gender, in my sexuality. And it was, and we were just having dinner. And that euphoric kind of affirmation stayed with me through the evening and gave me peace of mind. And almost always, because of a non-biblical worldview that my friend had for life, not being a believer, a distorted biblical worldview or worldviews that were trying to be imposed on us. When we get home, before we said goodbye at our different apartments and left, inevitably that euphoric affirmation just got blown up when she would say to me, wow, we do seem good together. Too bad you're gay. And then she'd leave. And it was just like a knife just went right through anything that was good and salvageable and affirming. And I think in those quiet kind of moments of loss, we make agreements. We make we hear from people around us, and that stands in direct contrast to what we know inside us. And when we try to be something we're not, and there's all kinds of things that in our biology that develops through puberty, if we're allowed to go through puberty in a normal, healthy way, that affirm our true identity as God designed it. And as believers or non-believers, if we can look at those kinds of attributes that just manifest and naturally grow, and call those things out and affirm those kinds of things, we may not get a real clear linguistic affirmation that we did the right thing, but we can't underestimate what we know as believers to be good and true. And if we can really look beyond the outward appearance, which sometimes can be really provoking, especially in this express yourself kind of culture. A person could be clearly a boy and be wearing makeup and earrings and trying as much as they can to act like the other gender. Even in that disintegrated kind of expression, there is the truth of who they are. And I think that that's what is really important that we do today, is instead of just kind of giving in and changing the pronouns and calling them she, instead of a he, is really looking through the eyes of the Holy Spirit and Christ at that person's humanity, and identifying those things, allowing the Holy Spirit to lead that conversation and pull out the good of who they are, because we don't know when the Lord will pull all that together for them. But I'll never forget those moments, as disintegrated as they may have been and as devastating as they were. I still go back to that, and I see the threads of how God has affirmed who I was created to be all those years, even in the most disoriented years.
So that reminder to speak truth, I think that's a good one, and to do so in a loving way, to affirm what God has made. That's, yeah, I think a wonderful way that we can serve. Anyone else?
I would add the importance of building relationship. Our goal in sharing the gospel is never to control somebody. The gospel of Jesus Christ, Jesus didn't die on the cross to make people straight. He died on the cross to make people children of God and to heal them from all kinds of brokenness. And God has not given us our neighbors so that we can feel better about ourselves or take away all of their pain, but God has given us our neighbors so that we may share life and receive blessings together. Sometimes that is a long, long process. From time to time, it will involve conversation, dialogue about sexuality and gender, but not always. As a matter of fact, a lot of the time, people who build relationships talk about other stuff. I know that may be hard to believe. They do other things together, but it's only in the context of those relationships and sharing life that our courage and compassion are really going to do the things that God has designed them to do, right? So healthy doses of humility, gentleness, respect, but also, like Pastor Barlow said, the importance of courage, of loving somebody enough to say the hard things, and then to back all of that up with commitment that says, I'm going to accompany you even through the difficult times. I'm going to remain dedicated to your well-being until you make it impossible for me to be around you anymore. But that especially holds true, for parents who are thinking about children who are experiencing gender dysphoria or loved ones who are going through confusion, recognizing that it is a long process. It takes many years to get to the point of being that broken. And so it takes a lot of time to come to a knowledge of the truth and to heal from those things. So being willing to share that time with people, not being so offended by the brokenness that we see in others that it repels us from them, but recognizing that we see a reflection of our own brokenness in them and a reflection of our God and Savior who created them and died for them.
Right. And that, go ahead.
I would just add one more thing, just to affirm what Michael said. Is just that, when it comes to living life with them, there's just this innate awkward place where we aren't really comfortable sitting in someone's grief and in their pain. We want them to get over it, feel better,
Right.
be better. And I think one of the things that is so personally healing for a person who is able to walk out of some of this disoriented, disfigured kind of way of living is when they're able to truly grieve their choices. Yes, there's always trauma and things that can be a part of the genesis of confusion. But there's still a person left behind that has made some decisions based on whatever's happened to them. They've made choices. Some of those choices have really hurt them personally, and some of their choices have really maimed their relationships with their moms and dads, with their brothers and sisters, with some friends. And when the Lord allows us to see our sin and his love for us, I think the lasting value is we're able to become more whole enough in our humanity that we can actually acknowledge that was bad, that I did that. And when we are allowed to cry with someone, and someone actually shares our tears for that, I think that is so healing, because it's life-changing, it's redirecting, it's true repentance. When there's that kind of contrition, that's where our minds really go a different direction. We're not gonna, our sanity is returned, our connections are returned. We're not, a sane person wouldn't go back and say, yeah, that's kind of life for me. I want to live like that. I want to keep doing those kinds of things that I did to someone else. And I think those places in relationship, those do take time, but those are intentional, to maybe pray more, say less, and just abide with them. But it's uncomfortable to see someone cry and to sob. But I think we need more space to be able to do that.
Yeah, I like that. Pray more. And especially if they are being convicted and recognize this is not the lifestyle that they want, right? This is they've made hard choices, right? To say less and to abide, to to support, right? To sit with them in their grief. It is true, right? In a lot of in an acronym that I teach about how to help someone with a life issue, one of the things I talk about is being yoked to them, right? Helping to carry that burden, maybe even helping to guide them out of the situation that they found themselves in, right? But if you love someone, you don't leave them there, right? But you help carry that cross as best you can. And as long as they will let you, like Michael mentioned, Pastor Salemink mentioned earlier, sometimes they remove themselves from the yoke, right? But then there's always prayer. There's always an opportunity to send letters, send texts, those sorts of things. So, Bonnie, any final words?
I would just echo what both of you pastors said, but just that speaking what is true. I think that especially in this situation of gender, the issue of gender identity is like we really do just we always have the truth on our side, but the other side, sort of the gender affirmation side, really doesn't have the truth. They're just telling people lies about themselves. And so it's, Pastor Barlow, you were talking about this, like when somebody affirmed what was true in you, it made a big difference. So to be able to say, God created you the way that you are, and God designed humanity to be binary this way. And just, telling them the truth is the most loving thing you can do, because all of these other influences are telling them lies about themselves. They're potentially their teachers at school, their counselor, maybe their parents, if their parents have been told to by the counselor. And so just reminding them what's true about them, I think is really, really, really important.
And maybe their own emotions, right? Their own body is telling them, or their own emotions are telling them a falsehood. We are broken, right? All right. Thanks so much for joining me today. I've appreciated your insights, and I hope that our listeners will enjoy it too. Thanks for those of you who are listening for listening to us. If you could like our podcast, share it with others, we would totally appreciate that. But between now and the next podcast, may God bless you, and may you be a voice for life. Thanks again.
Thanks for joining the Y4Life team for today's Table Talk for Life. We hope you're better equipped to address today's life issues and uphold the people God has placed in your path. Be sure to check out our programs and resources at y4life.org or email Michelle at y4life.org to find out more about how you can be a gospel-motivated voice for life. And we hope you'll join us next time, right here at Youth for Life Podcast.